Hello and welcome to the third episode of Bournemouth University Politics Podcast. My name is Finley Brown and today we are joined by Joshua Langham and George Rawlings. This week we'll be discussing the ongoing ethnic and territorial conflict over the embattled region of Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenian and Azerbaijan forces. We'll also be discussing the recent hearings of Amy Coney Barrett, Trump's nominee to replace the vacancy left by the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But first, shall we discuss the latest breaking news coming out of Westminster this afternoon, with the PM announcing that he may need to intervene in Manchester if the new COVID measures are not agreed to. A very ominous statement. Josh, what do you make of that?
I think it's hardly surprising, really, that the PM's said this because obviously it's such a contentious issue. The executive using its power to enforce powers locally without consulting the local people. But at the same time, it does really speak to the fact that even the PM knows that maybe the measures he's trying to enact won't be enough. I think we may be seeing this sort of policy come in across the country more as the measures obviously become seemingly redundant at certain points. And this was seen further with the just today, the televised broadcast on the latest COVID statistics. And there were suggestions that we're seeing upwards of 47,000 infections a day based on community surveys. So really, this crisis is only going in one direction.
Yeah, and what do you think of Andy Burnham, the Manchester mayor, coming out this week as well? Dominic Raab saying that he's holding the government over a barrel. What do you make of that?
I think realistically, it's hardly surprising that Andy Burnham is wanting to try and seek assurances from the government, because fundamentally he's the mayor of Greater Manchester. He should be the one who's putting in these measures and having an active dialogue with the Prime Minister and the rest of the cabinet. But I think that is what really has been the difficulty with this country's response to COVID, is the fact that they can't manage to seemingly agree on what measures to put in place. And then when the measures do get put in place, if they've been called for, it turns into a blame game, which has really embittered the whole process of trying to save people's lives.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's even talks of lawsuits and stuff like that. You do feel like some unity and some understanding on the Prime Minister's behalf, perhaps, and in Westminster for the position that he's in, balancing the economic needs with health needs. How do you first go about doing that, George? Do you have anything to say on the issue?
Well, I'd say I agree with you. I'm not surprised the PM is trying to step in to some degree. After all, you can't really have one place opposing your overall national, perspective. Because if one does it, everyone will. So he needs to sort of make sure he can push through his plan here, so everyone else can understand that he has the power to do that. If it not, of course, that would be up to the experts and people talk about it. But obviously, just down to politics itself, it makes perfect sense why he would at least try to force through his national perspective over a mayor.
Yeah. And shall we quickly explain the tier system? Josh, did you have a clarification of that?
Yes, because I know for most people this will have been a very difficult thing to understand. So I looked and found the BBC News article that did quite a good job of explaining what was going on. So I'll just put it up on the screen now. Yeah. And then we can
we'll just go through that, shall we? Yeah. No, it's confusing even for the best of us, kind of thing. Well, Boris Johnson got caught out the other week as well. He was misheard or misquoted or confused over what he in fact was enforcing, which was quite ironic.
Apparently, it won't let me show a screen thing until after I end the meeting. So I'll just read it out instead.
Yeah, that's fine. No problem.
Yep. So basically, medium is similar to medium tier 3, I think it is. No, tier 1.
Yeah.
Is the sort of measures that we've been seeing basically across the country for weeks now. Follow the rule of 6 if meeting indoors or outdoors, pubs and restaurants to shut at 10 p.m. Very standard at this point. Most people are getting used to those restrictions. High is no high, which may also be referred to as tier 2, is no household mixing indoors. So you can't go around to your mate's house and see them, for example, or go around to a family member's house unless it's support bubbles. I suppose that's still a thing. Rule of 6 will apply outdoors, very similar to medium in that respect. Pubs and restaurants to shut at 10 p.m. So basically, the only difference I can see between medium and high, or the most glaring difference, is you can't mix indoors.
Yeah.
And very high, which is what Lancashire has gone into recently, is no household mixing indoors or outdoors in the hospitality venues or private gardens, which is quite a big step forward. Rule of 6 applies in outdoor public spaces like parks. Pubs and bars not serving meals will be closed, and guidance against travelling in and out of the area, which really is quite a significant step forward, especially that travel guidance part. What I found quite amusing, though, was the BBC News alert for the Lancashire announcement read more like a football thing than anything else. It said, Lancashire has agreed the deal to enter Tier 3, the highest level of English COVID restrictions. It wasn't exactly the way I was expecting it to be phrased from the BBC, but
No.
still.
Well, it's almost framing it positively, I suppose. Agreed to a deal, implying that it's better off for both parts of the deal. But whether or not that is the case, I'm not sure. A lot of people, especially from Keir Starmer, put a lot of pressure on the government this week, coming out and quite overtly stating the need for a circuit break, perhaps over the October half-term period when schools are off. What do you make of that, George?
Circuit break. Sorry, who said this again? Sorry,
Keir Starmer this week. So he's come out and kind of put pressure on Boris, just to say that he thinks that a circuit break across the country is what is necessary to reduce the R rate, which is ultimately the big issue regarding the UK at the minute.
I'm terribly sorry. I'm maybe completely ignorant at this point, but what is he referring to when he means by circuit break? I might be.
So enforcing a national lockdown temporarily, so kind of breaking the circuit, so kind of disrupting and also kind of reinforcing in people's minds the need to socially distance and the fact that there is a pandemic. Obviously, with them being loosened, a lot of people have maybe become a bit more careless, a bit more forgetful. Or a bit even frustrated and kind of tiresome with the restrictions, and now they've been given a bit of freedom. Like if you give people an inch, they'll run a mile, kind of thing. I think so. A circuit break to kind of call everyone back, like unite the country again, and hopefully kind of get some measure and some control over the pandemic.
Well, I say that it's definitely possible, especially if the overwhelming majority of experts do support a harsher lockdown, which I see quite a few of them occasionally do come out and support such a thing. Of course, not normally government ones, but quite a few independent experts do tend to head towards that direction.
Yeah.
I would say yes, yeah, definitely that makes sure, especially on a social perspective at the very least, to enforce the ideas that it's not over yet. People are very much to return to life. Oh, it might be it's getting better, and maybe we have to knock that assertion out. However, I would understand the government not doing so, as I understand it does seem as if it's taking a step back, and I understand how that can also be quite decisive for many small business owners, as well as a lot of people who are very much sort of done with it, especially especially early on when we had a harsher lockdown. People still went out and protested and things, and it's so I would say that I'm not entirely sure if he does do this. Sorry, I'm backing up stuff. Basically, what I want to say is if he does do the harsh lockdown, I think you'd have to fully commit to it, to where that no large gathering or protesting can actually happen. We have to be harsh on it and be like, no, this is the rules now. Like at the very few early days, where more people being prosecuted and such and forth. So if you really want to do this, you have to go all in, I think. Else it's just going to be a very paper-win threat where everyone's like, oh, well, actually not, all the economy and then this and back and forth. So I think I understand what you mean. And now I understand what you mean by circuit breaker now, but it definitely could be a thing that would help, but I don't see the government doing it. It does sound like, at the very least, socially, it will be perceived as a step back. I understand the government wouldn't want to look weak. So just purely politically, I understand why they wouldn't, but I understand practically why they would. So it's a bit of a 50-50, and I'm not quite decided.
Yeah. So George, just briefly pointed up on the issue there of showing weakness on the Prime Minister's behalf if he were to backtrack. Do you think the reluctance is because of that? If so, that would be quite morally disputed amongst critics.
Realistically, this government has had enough U-turns at this point. I don't think they're worried about being called another one because everyone knows that this is the government of U-turns and backtracking on things. But yeah. I think that because I was reading some scientific advice from some of these, I think it came from some members of the SAGE Science Group, the sort of general advisory group for the PM, about how they think we should have a circuit breaker every school holiday, which would sort of break that line of transmission, especially in schools, which I thought was quite an interesting proposal.
Yeah, and psychologically as well, I think that would, whether or not, well, obviously economically it wouldn't be fantastic, but just to reinforce it in people's minds that we are still in a pandemic, because where we are in Bournemouth, you go out, you walk across the street, there are people still socialising, and it's tough to see, isn't it?
I went down into the Central Gardens yesterday. Quite a nice day, but still middle of October, wasn't particularly warm, and there was a group of 8 people sitting down on the grass chilling. And I was like, have you forgotten we are in the middle of a pandemic? I think people are relaxing to the point now where it's back to almost like before this even happened. You walk through the streets and maybe a few people have masks on, but at this point I think we really do need to start I know the government has had failings, but we do need to really get our heads back in this and think, right, we actually need to get these restrictions put back in place and start trying to get these numbers back down again, because for like 2 months at the end of July, it looked like we had this done. And then everything's just sort of spiraled out of control. Yeah. Again.
Exactly. And then there's the calls this week as well for the English football fans being frustrated, disgruntled at not being able to go to the grounds to watch their beloved football. What do you make of that? It's calls too soon to come back. But they're arguing that peace of mind and mental health, and I don't know, if you can sit on a plane, if you can go to school, why can't you socially distance at a football stadium?
I think for lower league teams, it's probably quite necessary because they generate a large amount of their ticket revenue through selling match day tickets. For Premier League clubs, I probably don't think it's as important, although it probably is a significant source of revenue, because obviously most of the Premier League clubs are giant global brands that can sell tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jerseys a season. So I don't think they'll be struggling that much for income. But at the same time, it really is a very difficult thing for the government, between balancing mental health, balancing the economy, and balancing the infection rate. Those are the 3 main sort of things that all intertwine when it comes to deciding the government's policy, I think.
Yeah, right. We'll leave the pandemic and COVID discussions for now. It does make up and take up a majority of the time every week. You can't.
I think it takes up a majority of the time for everything.
Yeah, you can't ignore it. You can't avoid it. Hence why we did briefly discuss it, but we're trying not to. We'll stay with UK politics for now, though, and we'll discuss the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill. Where basically it's crucial in preventing and safeguarding victims from many serious crimes, including terrorism, drugs, firearms offences, and child sexual exploitation. Josh, would you like to just first talk about it?
Yeah, this has been probably one of the most controversial bills that I've seen this year, aside from maybe the Internal Markets Bill slightly earlier. But really, what the bill is about is about the powers of the state to legalise, or not legalise, but to authorise crimes from covert sources, which are normally people in the community who have been recruited by the police to essentially do monitoring, is basically what they do. And reading the BBC article about it, there was quite a staggering thing that really jumped out to me, that every single foiled terrorist plot in the UK in the past few years has relied on covert sources of intelligence. Exactly the kind of thing this bill would seek to allow more of. Yeah. What they want to do is they want to allow these covert intelligence sources to commit crimes if it prevents a larger loss of life happening. So, for example, they want to allow, say, if someone's embedded with a drugs cartel, They want to allow them to become a drug dealer in order to stop large amounts of cocaine or large amounts of guns, weapons, whatever being distributed. Is essentially the gist of the bill that I got. But it is quite a difficult part of the bill that's being come up. Obviously, it's very morally questionable about whether we should be allowing state officers to commit serious acts of crime to stop even more serious acts of crime. But it doesn't just rely on violent crime, for example. Like, I didn't think about it this way until I read the article. But for example, the Environmental Agency needs covert sources for things like toxic waste to get into factories that are leaking toxic waste, or for the medicines industry to find or to infiltrate black markets as well. So it's quite difficult. And yeah, it's very, it has been a very, very divisive bill, because I think 35 Labour MPs defied the whip to vote against it when Keir Starmer said to vote against, which I find quite funny, that they think they know more about human rights abuses than a man who spent his career as a human rights lawyer. But that's besides the point.
No, and, quite a sizable rebellion, isn't it? Yeah.
It's quite funny how he's getting a rebellion when he's not even in government. Like,
yeah, exactly. It's the age-old issue, as you say, though. Of breaching your privacy, or it's to what extent, how far do you go in that? George, do you have anything to say?
Well, I'd say you guys summed it up quite well, but I would definitely point out and say that, in my perspective, from how you guys described it and what I've seen thus far, I would say that maybe a moderate version of the bill, or more moderate version, they are absolutely failing me. Maybe a more moderate one, where that they are allowed to get away with certain crimes to get in, but some should definitely be off limits.
Yeah.
For example, like rape and such things, I wouldn't want my government ever justifying. I mean, I understand you may want to have your agents engross themselves in these organizations, but there are certain limits, and I think it is theoretically a good idea to allow them not having to worry about drug deals and stuff like that, so they can get in deeper and actually end the organizations, which is I guess getting it done, as it were. But I would say there should definitely be limits, especially when it comes to like child trafficking and things. Those are definitely limits. And when one citizen is in danger, our agents are supposed to protect them. So if our citizens are in danger, their first priority should be to defend our nation and our people. So I think that maybe a more moderate version that wouldn't, but it would make sure there isn't any loopholes where these people can get away and abuse it anyway. Make sure our people aren't left out there, if you will.
Yeah. So calling for almost an amended version of the bill, just moderating it slightly. Yeah. Right. Move on, and we'll move away from UK politics and US politics, and discuss the ongoing conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. I'll briefly just describe the issue. So the two former Soviet states, Azerbaijan and Armenia, have clashed over the region. It's a 3-4 decade long dispute. Although it's an internationally recognized Azerbaijan area, and it has been, the conflict is more than like a Cold War era relic. Both sides enjoy the support of powerful backers, and the fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan could end up reverberating beyond the region, obviously involving other countries surrounding, which is very worrying. George, what do you have to say on the issue?
Well, of course, it's not a wonderful, happy issue, isn't it? Especially when the recent ceasefire seems to be, or in some reports, slowly breaking down once again. And of course, I think in the last round of conflict, about 500 or so have been killed.
Yeah, 550 Armenians or something like that. Yeah. Yes.
So it's definitely a worrying issue, and of course, the area is an autonomous zone of Azerbaijan. Terribly sorry, my pronunciation today is absolutely failing me. But yes, of course. So I understand very much why the Armenians are. I've seen both the interviews of the different governments, Of course, the Azerbaijani one refused the allegations that they were firing at civilian positions and said that their shells hitting various churches and so forth were targeting military assets. But of course, every state suggests that. And of course, I would understand why Armenia would be very worried. These are their people, as it were, just in another nation separated. And of course, persecution has been going back and forth either side. So you understand why liberation campaigns would be launched. But of course, the actions Armenia as well aren't all that good. Of course, they're also shelling back. So it is very much both ways. Blood flows either side. However, the worrying issue is, however, Azerbaijan is also negotiating itself with both Russia and Turkey.
Yeah.
From what I do remember. And the interview with the, I do believe it's Prime Minister or President, I'm not sure if I got his title correct, of Armenia, worrying about that, of course, worrying about Turkey's involvement and, of course, their relation to the Armenian genocide, things like that. So Turkish government still maintains position that there was no genocide, openly still lying about that. So you can understand why he'd be worried with an up-and-coming power like Turkey wanting to join and push their influence around. So I understand why they would rush to such a ceasefire so it doesn't escalate any further. However, I would say it's definitely a worrying issue. And of course, I'm not here to choose. That's, of course, international community, UN, and so. But what do you guys think?
Well, yeah, it's very concerning. But you also may raise a look to the bigger picture with Russia and Turkey already supporting opposing sides in Syria and Libya, and then the same transferring it over into this dispute is concerning. Josh, what do you have to say?
I think it's quite worrying how the two sides have broken down again. I was looking through the history of ceasefires, and it always seems to be 3 years of ceasefire, then they start shooting each other again and launching rockets. And maybe it's just my personal ignorance, but I'd never heard this conflict before until about a week or two ago. But it's quite interesting to see just how many autonomous states there are in the world that have violent clashes quite frequently between two warring nations. Like, it's clearly quite something that's quite common because of the way boundaries are drawn, which raises quite an interesting question about how we draw borders, especially as these borders are nearly 100 years old, I think, at this point. Like, it's quite because I think I'm right in saying that the region is like ethnically Armenian mainly. Like, yeah, so it's quite.
Yes. The autonomous region itself is ethnically Armenian, but the regions around it are not. Hence why it's.
Oh, right. That's why it's such a
contested issue. Yeah.
It's
right.
very yeah.
Right. We'll move on. We'll just quickly talk about the recent hearings of Amy Coney Barrett in news this week. I got a sense that she was very drilled. She's a very smart lady, clearly, and answers to contentious questions. She responded very cleverly with a very large focus on the words that she was using. Very diplomatic. We didn't really want to say too much. Almost like almost perfect response, as if she had been well rehearsed before. Josh, what do you have to say?
I think it's quite an interesting scenario, especially when compared to the Kavanaugh hearings a few years ago. And there have been a few moments that have obviously stood out. The bit about judicial originalism is quite a contentious thing in America. I saw Hillary Clinton tweet about it because there was a soundbite saying like, "Oh, it's my." Barrett said something along the lines of, "Oh, it's my job to interpret the Constitution, or my job to enforce the Constitution as the fans intended it." And then Clinton came out with something along the lines of, "Back when they wrote it, neither of us could vote, let alone sit on the Supreme Court," or something like that.
Yeah.
I know there was a moment that got in quite hot water about the use of a specific phrase about sexual preference instead of sexual
orientation.
Orientation, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know whether that's like that's obviously not something I can really comment on. But obviously, she's a fairly conservative judge, so it's not hard to imagine what her views on gay marriage are. And especially on things like abortion, gay marriage, these will all feed into the supposed culture war, I feel like. And I think it came out yesterday, the news story where a top Senate Republican says he has the votes to confirm Amy Coney Barrett, which obviously with a very divided party in America is, if they can get the votes to confirm her before the election, I think they'll probably go through with that.
Yeah, exactly. No, it is definitely doable. Barrett would become the third justice on the court to be appointed by Trump, and her confirmation would give conservatives a 6-justice majority on the 9-member court, which decides the cases by a simple majority. She's as you say, a conservative Christian, critical of the court's decision to uphold the Affordable Care Act. Who has publicly opposed reproductive rights. A trustee at school whose handbook included stated opposition to same-sex marriage. Is a power play by Trump. What do you think, George?
Well, of course, it definitely is you said, a power play by Trump, isn't it? It definitely is. Well, even if he does get voted out, it is his mark if he does win. And of course, I'm not surprised in how she responded. Most court justices and so forth are very tactical, how they, especially with everyone uses every word they can against them. Of course, her interpretation is very controversial in America, especially with how politicized the judicial system is over there, and especially how much power it's basically given itself over the years. But of course, that's their own issue. I will say her interpretation does seem rather not too radical. Of course, it is radical in how socially we would interpret it, but I imagine if she would be rather literalist in how she interprets her interpretation of the general rules, I imagine she wouldn't be as worrying as some people have suggested, as the fact that, of course, in the Constitution, it's the job of the legislators to create the laws and amend the Constitution and so forth. So it might be the original intent of these laws to do something, but it's our job now to edit those laws to bring them into a modern perception. Presumably that would work within a framework, for example, of how she sees the legal system and the laws and so forth.
Yeah.
So even if Trump were to lose and Democrats were to bring in, I imagine she would still oppose you on certain issues from her moral perspective, I imagine. However, from a legal perspective, I can imagine she wouldn't be the worst person to deal with. Of course, on certain issues, she'll be probably fully politicized, and she might be just using her legal justification as a justification for those views, because it just happens to fit in. But if she is truly of that perspective of the originalist sort of line of thinking, as it were, not the correct term, but I'll run with it. I reckon they could work with that, because of course it makes full sense. If a law is made today with this perception, it also works in their favor. So if they create a law with their very progressive perception, she has to enforce it as that law because it's on their perception. So I imagine it's a worry for people on the progressive side of the left, I imagine. However, it's not the most radical choice, I wouldn't say. I would say certain issues definitely, but let's not worry too much. That's what I'm throwing out there. It could be. There are more radical interpretations, let's put it this way.
Yeah, and from the hearing, she has kind of understated her role almost, kind of saying she's just another justice. It's very interesting that in terms of the legacy of Trump, if this does go through, this will arguably be his largest effect. Would you agree, Josh?
Oh, definitely. I think from my mind, I think the last president to be able to put through 3 confirmations this quickly must have been Reagan's second term. I can't think of any time after that where there's been such quick judicial appointments like we've seen now, 3 in 4 years. Trump, if he is a one-term president, he will certainly have had an impact on America through Paris, through Iran, through everything. But this is definitely one of those things because she's not an old woman. She'll be on the court for 30 years. Right? And it's very interesting. I think that's one of the most interesting parts of the American judicial system.
Yeah.
The fact that their judges are appointed in such a blatantly partisan way, which is quite interesting for something that's supposed to be an independent body.
Yeah, he's definitely leaving his mark. Whether or not he stays in for another term, who knows? At the minute, it's come out that Biden leads Trump by 17 points as the election race kind of enters its final stages. Obviously, polling is a contentious topic. Often, well, in the last few years anyway, it seems to be not too accurate.
The only issue with the polling thing is that pollsters normally try and overcompensate for previous errors in polling. So that'll mean that if Biden's polling pretty well now, then we could expect him to do even better than he is in the future. Then could expect him to do even better. But at the same time, many of the models did give Clinton overwhelming majority to win the electoral college, obviously, but there was still the chance that Trump would win. I don't think I saw any like statistical modeling that said, "Oh yes, 100% that Clinton will win." And
no,
we saw how small the boundaries were between Trump winning and losing in places or in certain districts in Michigan and Pennsylvania. That's really how it was such a small likelihood of it happening, and that's how it actually happened.
Yeah. So a lot more discussion to be had on those issues. I think we'll wrap up there.
That's
thank
been
you,
a good,
Josh. Thank you, George.
Discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
And we will be back next week for more discussion. There you go. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.